Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Golden Ashes podcast. Tonight's conversation is going to be on Dionysus versus Apollo, a vocabulary for modernity through the lens of myth. And before we get started, I want to do a bit of housekeeping. So first and foremost, I would like to apologize for my voice. I was doing a 6-hour podcast yesterday with my friends over at Eternal White Boy Summer Radio and with King Pilled, and I was not expecting that conversation to go 6 hours, but it did go 6 hours, and I lost my voice as a result. And so you might ask why I'm uploading today. This is my first podcast, so it's not like I'm on a schedule. And for you, that is true. I am not on a schedule, but for me, I am on a schedule. And so let me explain what that schedule is. This is going to be the format kind of as I find my own voice, pun intended, and get started. So the first 10 or so weeks here, play it by ear there. It could be longer, it could be shorter. It just depends how things play out, how quickly I get through the introductory concepts that I want to get through before we get a little bit more esoteric. So basically the format is I'm going to be publishing between 1 and 3 articles a week on Substack. Feel free to follow me on Substack at Golden Ashes, as well as on X at Filius X Aureus. That's FILIUSEXAUREUS. I'll link it somewhere. I'll probably just change that username to Golden Ashes to make it a little bit more synchronized. But so anyways, I'm going to be publishing 1 to 2 articles, maybe 3 articles a week, doing introductory concepts. And the podcast for the time being is going to synthesize the ideas in those articles, as well as give an additional context and go deeper into some of the vocabulary laid out. And so this week specifically, the 2 articles I wrote, the first one being called An Introduction to Our Time, and the second, Nature versus Technology. And we're not going to so much get into the nature versus technology today, although it is important in the grand scheme of Dionysus and Apollo. Typically, Dionysus is relegated to the realm of nature, and Apollo, although he is a sun god, is typically seen as more industrious and martial. So that would be the technological side. We do touch on that more in the podcast that I did yesterday. That will be up at some point. So that side of things is technically covered. So I don't want to beat a dead horse for those of you who will be listening to both. Tonight, we're going to focus in on the article of Introduction to Our Time, and I'm not going to rehash too much of it, but essentially the key concepts that I want to take away from that article, excuse me, is the European project America as an extension of the European project. And so what I mean by this is if you look at Proto-Europe, Proto-European, specifically around the time of the Aryan invasion, what you had horse lords from the steppe coming down and conquering into Europe, into the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. And what happened was they would leave a vanguard behind in previously conquered lands, and then they would send out the youngest and the fittest among them to conquer new territory. And so what this led to was a very closely related diaspora of people where you had cousin groups of people. You see this with the ancient Greeks, with the Dorians and the Achaeans, or in Rome with the Roman stock coming from the remnants of the Trojan War and how they are a cousin race of the Goths and the Visigoths and the Germanic tribes, and how this kind of plays into Spengler's concept of in his book Man and Technics, which is a short little exposition in between volumes 1 and 2 of Decline of the West, where he wants to know why conservatives don't win in big cities. It's essentially the question he's asking himself. And what he comes up with is the cities are anti-cultural. Because they're dominated by the merchant class. So you don't have the aristocrats who typically are on the countryside. They really do come from that Grecian horse lord sort of framework where they want space, they want freedom to operate. And if there's anything you don't have in a city, it's space and freedom of movement, freedom of expression and self-expression, that is. And the cities are dominated by the merchant class. And so what the merchant class is they are typically, now obviously you can have merchants from your specific population group, but that's not quite what we're talking about. What we're talking about are merchants who would come typically into the port city, and they're from a different nation, a different ethnicity, and their job is to mediate with the king in order to have access to the population of that group. And over time, what happens is, as the merchant class becomes more pervasive in the city, you have the breakdown of culture, because again, culture is generated by the elite. It really is a trickle-down economy. And the cities are protected from this aristocratic group because they're on the fringes. They're at King's Court, of course, but they're not in this merchant caste diaspora. And so you have a breakdown of the social hierarchy, of the traditions of the people in cities that you don't have in the countryside, because the country, oftentimes you have to retain those values in order to survive. And what this has kind of created in the modern West, because our societies are dominated by mercantilism, you have a breakdown of culture by and large where people don't remember who they are. They don't remember where they came from. And this has created two problems in my estimation. One of them is we have a crisis of elites where, yeah, we have elites, but I'm not talking about elites in the Jonesian sense of the word, like some kind of shadowy cabal who is secretly organizing the destruction of the nation. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It's just not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about elites in the aristocratic sense of cultural generators who understand where they're from, what their job is, and their role with the people to protect the populace, mostly from cosmopolitan mercantilism. That's what we don't have. All of our elites today are from the mercantile class. And the second crisis we have, going back to this, the Goths and the Romans, or the Vikings and the British, we don't have barbarians left. And again, just like with the elites, we have barbarians. Go to any inner city in the West and you will find barbarians. But what we don't have is a closely related group who is uncivilized by the empire, ready to capitalize on the decadence of the empire as that mercantilism kind of reaches its end phase and decadence runs rampant and good times create weak men. at the end of the good times, as those weak men take over and you get the hard times, and the hard times create strong men. Often through history, what you see is those strong men aren't from the native populace of the empire. They're the barbarian hordes. It's those Viking raiders, the Normans who have integrated with the empire, that revitalize it and give fresh blood and new ideas to the empire, that allows it to reformat and start new. So one of the things we talked about in our podcast last night is America still America if we undergo dramatic change in the next 5, 10, 50, 100 years? And one of the things that we brought up was, well, Rome went through 3 key changes. So you went from a monarchic Rome to Republic Rome to the Caesars. And looking back, we still call all of it Rome. And likely moving forward, we'll still call whatever comes next America. But it's that barbaric revitalizing of the tired old stock. So one of my key projects initially here is going to be discussing the mechanisms for barbarism in a very tame, civilized sense. Like, how can you be a modern day barbarian? What does that mean? What does it mean to be barbaric in your thinking, in your philosophies, as well as, because again, these are our empires that are crumbling. These are our empires that are decadent. And we don't have the Vikings or the Goths or the Scythians to come and provide the fresh blood. We have to do it ourselves. We have to remind our elites and create new elites, a new aristocracy, a new aristocratic class. And, no one's coming to save us. Not to black pill. I'm not black pilled. I'm not going to make you take the black pill. But we also have to understand where we are. And so getting back to the topic at hand of Dionysus and Apollo, or the Dionysian and the Apollonian, let's define these terms. So what does it mean to be Dionysian? Well, Dionysus is the god of wine and theater, and his followers, as well as Dionysian people today, typically embody the spirit of ecstasy, chaos, and the release of inhibitions, as well as a rejection of rationality. Very specifically, the cult of Dionysus in ancient times, they would take hallucinogenics, they would drink wine, and they would engage in orgy and all of these other things, and they would reject the mind, they would reject rationality. They were very much anti-Stoic in their thinking. And so that kind of thinking characterizes the left today. So typically it's seen as very free spirit, but we're going to talk about that. It's not as black and white as you may think. So now that we have Dionysus, or the Dionysian, clearly defined, let's move forward and let's look at Apollo. So Apollo was a god of war. He was a god of music. He was a god of harvest. And the Apollonian represents moderation, temperance, embracing order, reason, and harmony, seeking beauty and clarity, striving for self-control and enlightenment. Really, to be Apollonian is to pursue balance and moderation, where you see the mind as a tool to navigate the world and to gain insight into the world. And so clearly that is more, today it's definitely more of a right-wing thing to be Apollonian, right? So if you have a military structure, the last thing you want to be, or the first thing you want to be, is you want to be ordered. You want to have hierarchy. That's one of the most clearly succinct ways to define the opposition of the left and the right is, do you believe in a hierarchy? And so to be Apollonian is to be hierarchical. And I do want to say I'm using a mythological lens to present this juxtaposition to give this economy of vocabulary to the conversation. But I myself am not a pagan. I'm an Orthodox catechumen. Because I'm a catechumen and I'm very young in my faith, I don't want to speak too much on what you should do or any of those sorts of things. I'm a philosopher at heart. I've studied philosophy for at least the last 15, 18 years. And I just don't want to turn off any Christians that might be listening to this. I myself am a Christian. I am simply giving a vocabulary and definition to a problem that I don't see clearly defined. And I'm going to attempt to give a roadmap in terms of what we can do about it, what we can do about these problems. So as you move forward into the Dionysian or the Apollonian, whichever side of the spectrum you fall on, what's going to happen is as you go through life, you become more rigid in your habits, in your routines, and as well as in your philosophies. Like, try changing your boomer dad's mind about anything. Like, it's not going to happen. So but with the philosophical, with the spiritual, and specifically with the Dionysian and the Apollonian, one of the things that happens as you solidify in your mode of being, that process begins to invert. So you become very ordered and hierarchical if you're a Dionysian about your hedonism. And so we see this time and time again on the left, right? Think of the way they react to just being posed a question about, I don't know, something as simple as biology. And there's a pretty popular meme that's been going around recently. I'll post it somewhere where it shows the difference of thought rigidity on the left versus the right, and how on the left you have an incredibly close-knit group of ideological framework. Meanwhile, on the right, what you have is you don't really have a unified system of thought, right? You have a diaspora of thought. And what you really have is several ideological coalitions who are defining themselves in opposition to the left. And this is one of the articles I've planned for next week. So I don't want to get too much into it right now. But what happens and what is happening on the right now is because we have such a broad coalition, and we have hierarchy, and we have routine, and we embody the Apollonian, we have a very Dionysian approach to problem solving, to open-minded ideas in terms of the allowability of conversation. And part of the reason that is because we have no institutional power. The right wing, sure, we might have some politicians here and there, but if you're a young right wing man, as I'm sure you are listening to this, and you are asked, "Oh, hey, what do you think about politician A, who is a right wing politician in theory?" I'm sure you're going to hate them more than you like them, because we are a coalition of ideas, a coalition of ideologies in a very tentative alliance against what we perceive, correctly I might add, as institutional and existential threat to our society. And so if you're in a military, you don't want to be rigid in your thought process. You want your leadership, you want your generals to be able to problem solve. You want them to be free thinkers. You want them to be innovative. You don't want, well, the military has done this with the cavalry, And so we might be outnumbered, but we're going to do this again. You are going to lose. And because we have no institutional power, we can't be like that. Obviously, there's a difference between the rank and file and the generals. And part of that is understanding where you fall in that hierarchy and knowing your role. And so what I want to talk about now, so as you solidify and you calcify and you invert in a principled sense, so Apollonian with a Dionysian thought process or Dionysian with an Apollonian thought process, excuse me, you're going to embody certain morals or ethics. And so I want to take a brief amount of time. And again, this is another article that I have planned for next week, to talk about the difference between morals and ethics and what that looks like. And so a moral system is externally imposed. So being a Christian, if you're a Christian or if you're a pagan or if you're an atheist or whatever the case may be, a moral system is externally imposed, right? A moral system is the American judicial system. Don't speed when you're on the interstate because we'll pull you over and give you a fine. If you were left to your own devices, or if no one else is on the road with you and it's 2 a.m. and you're tired and you want to get home, like I was last night, you might go a little fast because the immediate threat of the moral punishments aren't present. Or maybe they are. You don't know. So a moral system is it's external to your own valuation tentatively. An ethical system is internally derived. And so let's take a look at some ethical systems in terms of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And we're going to talk about, again, kind of this left-right paradigm. And so some examples of Dionysian ethical systems, you have situational ethics, which is you derive the correct answer depending on the situation. You have emotivism, so it's a hedonistic approach to what is good. Well, what is good is what makes me happy. It's based on emotions. It might be your emotions. It might be the emotions of the person you're dealing with. Do I say this to this person because it's true? Well, if I say it, it might upset them. And that's where you get all the emotional policing that you see today. Situational ethics, same thing. And pragmatism or utilitarianism. These are some examples of Dionysian ethical systems. An Apollonian ethical system would be deontology, which comes from Immanuel Kant, which gives us the moral imperative. So the moral imperative says if we know something is wrong, then it's wrong in every situation. So if lying is wrong, it doesn't matter the situation you're placed in, it's wrong all the time. Clearly, you can see the Apollonian hierarchy coming through here with I will always tell the truth. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, you see a moral imperative or a deontology when it comes to honesty. Virtue ethics, which we are going to talk about in a moment. Virtue ethics is essentially where you aim at a specific virtue. You get this with Nietzsche, where he says, pick your virtue and hold it close to you and organize your life around it. Nietzsche meant it somewhat in a Dionysian sense. And we're going to do a lot on Nietzsche, specifically because he's so misunderstood. Everyone wants Nietzsche to be what they think he is. And so Nietzsche talks about virtue ethics specifically in a Dionysian sense. But one of the things you have to understand is Nietzsche was trying to rally against, again, like a what he perceived as a pre-collapsing Western world. So he wanted to be Dionysian with his thoughts, but he does it in a very Apollonian way. And then another example of Apollonian ethics would be contractarian ethics, or contractual obligation. This could also be defined as like the social contract. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a legal contract. Like, I signed a contract to buy my house, so now I am contractually obligated to pay my mortgage or they'll take it. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be the social contract. Like, I'm sitting on the bus, I don't want the person behind me to stab me in the neck. And so I want to focus in on virtue ethics. I think that virtue ethics are immediately essential to right-wing ideology. Even with the presence of a moral system like Christianity, that does not absolve you from having an ethical system. That does not absolve you from developing virtue. And what does it mean to develop virtue? So again, going back to Nietzsche, one of the things we could do is we could look at courage. And you're going to take courage and you're going to develop it in your daily life. So that could be, if you see someone doing something in public that is unacceptable, you say, hey, this is not acceptable in my functioning society. We don't have to live like this. I'm not going to let you do that. I'm going to step in and be courageous where I might not have otherwise been. And it's not something you're immediately going to be successful at. It takes time to build virtue. You aim at it and you pursue it in your daily life. And one of the things that the calcification of the Apollonian nature of the right wing, one of the things that will lead to is that Nietzschean transvaluation of values. And you need to have a transvaluation of values, especially because in context of rebarbarianizing or introducing a new aristocratic element to a decadent society, you have to look at the values of society and evaluate them on their own merits, but also in a relationship to how they integrate with the things you believe. So, society tells you that it's good to be courageous. It's good to go out there and live your truth. Well, what about Nick Fuentes? Would we say he's being courageous? Would we say someone like Tucker Carlson is being courageous? Well, society might say no. Mark Levin just said they were cowards. And it's that transvaluation of not only the virtue itself, but also the definition. You're transvaluating the definition into a personal context. And that will precede a transmutation of yourself into sort of an archetype of that virtue. And this is something that we see in society all the time, where institutions are very Apollonian, but they're made up by Dionysian people. And so they know that we want to live in functioning societies. They know that we want to live in a place to raise our children. And so they take our Apollonian ethics of, say, the social contract and say, well, we're all going to be nice to each other and get along. And so that becomes the nail. And then the hammer is always the Dionysian. the hammer is always utilitarianism. It's, oh, well, we have to break the contract this time because now that there is a diaspora of people living here, we need to be utilitarian in our application of the social contract. We can't send this person to prison because if we send this person to prison for doing this one thing, then we have to send all these other people who did the same thing to prison. And we don't want to send everyone to prison because that's not free. They're not free if we send them all to prison. They are like, we're just going to let them all go. We're going to give them a slap on the wrist and set them free. And so what that creates is a system where a lot of us find ourselves on the fringes. And one of the things that prevents this transvaluation is fear. You know, you're not getting involved in local politics. You're not getting involved with other young men. You're not forming the manor bund, as, you know, Bronze Age pervert or other people in the space might say. It's, well, you know, I might get involved, but I'm afraid. And so one of the ways that you will interpret this, because your mind doesn't want to let you know that you're afraid. So you'll feel this fear of getting involved, speaking out, as pride. And this kind of brings to the forefront of what I mean when I say re-barbarianize. Like, we have no space for pride. We've been losing for too long. And one of the things that I don't want to do on this podcast is talk about current events politically, where I want to try and keep this very an academic approach to this. But sometimes we're gonna revert to a geopolitical or current events vocabulary, just because it's immediate, and I don't want to have to explain every reference for listeners who might not have as broad of a historical context. That's more what the articles are for. So we're going to stay away from current events, but you know, with this MAGA civil war we have going on right now, some call it the death of MAGA. Others call it America first versus Israel first. As right wingers, you know, we, as young men, as the inheritors of the Western project, we don't have a home in the institutions. And part of the the barbarianizing process is siege mentality. And there's no room for pride when you have nothing to lose. There's no room for fear. You know, you're not going to live your life to the fullest. You're not going to be able to properly transvaluate those values. You're not going to be able to live a proper Apollonian life. If you have children, you know, like the meme says, no son wants a weak father. No daughter wants a timid dad. And so part of the process is purging that fear from you. And you want to live on the periphery. I saw a post by Harry Miller on Instagram, H. Miller. I think there's some numbers associated with that, where he was talking about how when Caesar was sieging Rome, he told his legionaries to aim for the face of Pompey's rank and file, because he knew that the supporters of Pompey were the old world aristocrats, the conservatives who didn't want their system to die. And he knew that they were afraid They were more afraid to be disfigured than they were to lose. And Caesar's army had nothing to lose. They were already branded traitors. They were already pariah. They were already outlaws. And this is something that, the right has dealt with for a long time, is you're a social pariah. Don't believe me? Don't do this. Maybe you do. I don't know. Go tell your boss your politics. Thanksgiving's coming up. Bring it up at the family table. And so when you're already on the fringes, when you're already a pariah, when you're already socially an outlaw, there's no room for fear. You've more or less already lost, and now you're fighting to take back what you believe is rightfully yours, what is rightfully yours as a son of the West. What your forefathers built and handed down belongs to you. And there's nothing to fear. Like Ben Franklin said, hang together or we'll hang separately. And so with that, I'm going to wrap this up. Short episode 1. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, DM me. Let's get a conversation going. Share this with anyone you might know who you think would be interested, or, take something beneficial away. Follow me on Substack. That's where you have access to all the articles that I'm writing. Follow me on Twitter. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.